Conflicts are produced when men ignore their self-interest and accept the notion that sacrifice is beneficial. Sacrifice is always anti-life. In summary, man by his nature must choose to think and produce in order to live, and the better he thinks, the better he will live. Since each man's own life makes his values possible, chosen behavior which furthers his life as a thinking being is the moral, and chosen behavior which harms it is the immoral. Without free choice, morality is impossible. Therefore, rational thought and the action of their rewards, emotional, physical, and material, are the whole of man's self-interest. The opposite of self-interest is sacrifice, which is always wrong because it's destructive of human life. Any society in which men can realize their full potential and live as rational and productive human beings must be established in accordance with these basic facts of man's nature. It must be a society in which each man is left unmolested, in which he's free to think and to act on his ideas without anyone else trying to force him to live his life according to their standards. Not only must each man be free to act, he must also be free to fully enjoy the rewards of all of his pro-life actions. Whatever he earns in emotional joy, material goods, and intellectual values such as admiration and respect must be completely his. He must not be forced against his will to give up any of it for the supposed benefit of others. He must not be forced to sacrifice, not even for the good of society. To the extent that a man isn't free to live his life peacefully according to his own standards and to fully own whatever he earns, he is a slave. Enslaving men for the good of society is one of the most subtle and widespread forms of slavery. It's continually advocated by priests, politicians, and quack philosophers who hope by the labor of the enslaved to gain what they haven't earned. A society in which men can realize their full potential must be one in which each man is free to act in his self-interest according to the judgment of his own mind. The only way a man can be compelled against his will to act contrary to his judgment is by the use or threat of physical force by other men. Many pressures may be brought to bear on a man, but unless he's compelled by physical force or the threat of force or a substitute for force to act against his will, he still has the freedom to make his own choices. Therefore, the one basic rule of a civilized society is that no man or group of men is morally entitled to initiate or to start the use of physical force, the threat of force, or any substitute for force, such as taking something from another person by stealth, against any other man or group of men. This doesn't mean that a man may not defend himself if someone else initiates force against him. It does mean that he may not start the use of force. To initiate force against anyone is always wrong, because it compels the victim to act contrary to his own judgment. But to defend oneself against force by retaliating with counterforce is not only permissible, but it is a moral imperative whenever it's feasible or reasonably safe to do so. If a man really values his values, he has a moral obligation to himself to defend them. Not to do so would be sacrificial and therefore self-destructive. The difference between initiated force and retaliatory force is the difference between murder and self-defense. Pacifists who have consistently refused to defend themselves when attacked have frequently been killed. The belief in pacifism is anti-life. As long as a man doesn't initiate force, the actual goals and interests which he chooses to pursue don't control the free choice or threaten the goals of anyone else. It doesn't matter whether a man goes to church every day or advocates atheism, whether he wears his hair long or short, whether he gets drunk every night or uses drugs or stays cold sober, whether he believes in capitalism or voluntary communalism, so long as he doesn't reach for a gun or a politician to compel others to live as he thinks they should. As long as men mind their own business and don't initiate force against their fellow men, no one's lifestyle is a threat to anyone else. When a man initiates force against another man, he violates his victim's rights. A right is a principle which morally prohibits men from using force or any substitute for force against anyone whose behavior is non-coercive. A right is a moral prohibition. It doesn't specify anything with regard to what actions the possessor of the right may take, so long as his actions are non-coercive. It morally prohibits others from forcibly interfering with any of his non-coercive actions. For example, a beachcomber has the right to life. This right says nothing of what the beachcomber may do with his life. It says only that no one else may forcibly interfere with his life so long as he doesn't initiate force or fraud against them. Suppose, however, that the beachcomber does initiate force against a cab driver and does $100 worth of damage to the taxi cab. In order to rectify the injustice, the beachcomber must pay the cabbie $100. The beachcomber does not, then, have the right to whatever part of his life and or property that's required to make reparations to the cabbie. The cabbie has a just claim to it. Suppose further that the beachcomber will not willingly pay the $100. The cabbie is no longer morally prohibited from using force against the beachcomber to collect what is now rightfully his. The beachcomber, by his initiation of force against and to the detriment of another man, has alienated himself from the right to that part of his life which is required to pay his debt. Rights are not inalienable, but only the possessor of a right can alienate himself from that right. No one else can take a man's rights from him. Each person has a right to his own life, which means that each person is a self-owner, assuming that his behavior has been and is non-coercive. Because a man has a right to his own life, he has the same right to any part of that life. Property is one part of a man's life. Material goods are necessary to sustain life, and so are the ideas which a man generates. So man invests his time in generating ideas and in producing and maintaining material goods. A man's life is made up of time, so when he invests his time in material or intellectual property, ideas, he is investing parts of his life, thereby making that property an extension of his life. The right to property is part of the right to life. There's no conflict between property rights and human rights. Property rights are human rights. Another aspect of man's life is his freedom of action. If a man is not free to use his body, his mind, and his time in any action he wishes, so long as he doesn't initiate force or fraud, he is in some degree a slave. The right to liberty, like the right to property, is an aspect of the right to life. All rights are aspects of the right to life, which means that each man has the right to every part of his own life. By the same token, he's not morally entitled to any part of another man's life, assuming the other man has not initiated force or fraud against him. Any right which violates someone else's right is no right at all. There can be no such thing as a right to violate a right, or rights would be meaningless. A man has the right to earn a decent living, but he does not have the right to a decent living if it must be provided by force out of someone else's earnings. That is, he has no right to enslave others and force them to provide his living, not even if he does so by getting the government to pass a law taxing others to make payments to him. Each individual is the owner of his own life, and no one else's. Rights are not a gift of God or of society. They're the product of the nature of man and of reality. If man is to live a productive and happy life and realize his full potential as a human being, he must be free from coercion by other men. The nature of man demands that he must have values and goals in order to live. Without them, human life is impossible. When a man is not free to choose his own goals, he can't act on the feedback from his behavior, and so he can't correct his errors and live successfully. To the extent that a man is forcibly prevented by others from choosing his own values and goals, he is a slave.